Hi, this is the authors of Growing Up Aspen have started a second season podcast called Movie Chat, where we talk with some of our fellow students in the industry and talk about films and all kinds of fun things. Today we are here with Ben Ball, who is an environmental designer, sculpturist, and has did a little stint with movie set designs and worked on The Matrix. So let's catch up with Ben.
So one of the things we talked about in the prior podcasts, Ben, with on this movie topic, when we were talking to Adam Kane, we got into a lot of film production and stuff where he was talking about different things, like how AI has affected storyboarding and really all kinds of stuff. I thought it'd be good to pick your brain, and maybe I'll just throw this out there. Give me a horror story on production of one of the films you worked on.
Does it have to be a horror?
Well, or it could be who knows, man. Let's just open a different convo.
I worked on the talking magazine scene in my own private Idaho. That was
Oh,
my
you did.
first effects thing. But,
Okay.
but you did some set design stuff, right? I mean, Ken Adams was known for doing those crazy big Bond sets. Um,
Right. I never worked for Ken Adam.
no, no, but you did do
Uh,
some stuff, right?
I did. Yeah. I worked as a an assistant to production designers, assistant art director, whatever you would call it, on a commercial in the mid '90s, late '90s. Worked on a lot of commercials uh, for a few different production designers. I don't like the word production designer when it's applied to a commercial because I
Right.
think it's a very pretentious term to apply to a commercial. I think, if you know like the history of those terms,
Yeah.
I understand it is the the term production designer was pulled out uh, uh, was created when they made Intolerance because Intolerance was so epic in its scale. Uh, it had so many sets and such big sets
Uh-huh.
that they needed to have a number of art directors. So they created this term called production designer, which was like the Uber art director
Right.
who oversaw all these other art directors. Because before that film, it was primarily the term was art director, and it makes sense, right? You have a
Yeah.
director of photography, you have an art director, you have a director, you have a, you know, it's not this com- complicated term. Anyway, so yeah, I worked on commercials from maybe 93 to 99 or 2000. Um, Commercials, music videos, a few movies, and it was a good run. Yeah, I started working on pretty big commercials because I got in with this production designer. His name's Nick Rafter, and he was working for RSA,
Uh-huh.
Ridley
Yeah.
Scott and Associates, and so we worked on. I think the first thing I ever worked on, I think, was a big it was like a big beer commercial, and we built this set and a stage in Raleigh studios that was like a reproduction, like it was meant to look like a New Orleans hotel. Um,
Hmm.
I remember Nick was interested in it looking like the sets from Barton Fink
Oh, right.
Hmm.
by the Coen brothers, and
Yeah.
and we so we kind of meticulously kind of recreated this um, New Orleans sort of tired hotel, smoky hotel look. And Nick ended up getting fired, and they brought on this other art director, Arthur Max, who ultimately did a bunch of he did several movies for Ridley Scott. I think he might have done Gladiator. Anyway, I never worked for Arthur Max, but I remember having a conversation with him after the production, like my team got fired. And I just remember him, he's English. It seemed like they were all English at
Right.
that time in Hollywood. Every
Yeah.
production designer I encountered, it's a bit of an exaggeration, not everyone, but a lot of them were English at that time. And that was, it was probably for a few reasons. One being the commercial business at the time seemed to be dominated by several English producers, and RSA being a big one, and then it'll come to me the names of some of the other ones.
Well, a
But
lot of those ad agencies have pretty big footprints in other countries, and they have a
yeah,
branch here, but they're big footprints out there. And I picked up on a lot of that too.
yeah, yeah. So I worked on a lot of commercials for those kinds of companies, and it was great because I was really like using like my architecture training to, because these were big builds, they were big budget commercials, and you're spending a lot more money per minute on a commercial than
Right.
you are even on a feature film.
Yeah.
So in most cases, unless it's like, Batman. So we were, I got to work on a lot of really fun stuff. The horror stories, I have a few horror stories. One one was, we were working. I started working. I'm not going to name names here because they probably,
Yeah, that's
maybe
fine.
some of these people might see this, but the art director, the guy who was kind of Nick Rafter, it's right hand man, broke off and started. Who's also English, broke off and started doing commercials on his own, and he we were working on something. I can't remember what it was for, and I can't even remember the director. It was a big director. The director was like Sam Baer or somebody really big at the time, and who isn't English, but we were building a set at Raleigh Studios, or no, at Sony Studios, and this production designer, I'm kind of doing the drawings for him and stuff, and he can't make up his fucking mind, and the clock is ticking, till camera, and he's tweaking things and adjusting things and reworking things, which is fine until you start to build. And then we're building the set. We have this big set company out there building the set on the stage, and then he's making these tweaks, and he obsessed so much about the tweaks that the set was not done on time for, lighting it for camera. And I just remember talking to the construction coordinator, who's, building all this, and he's like, I've never seen anything like this before. He's like, this is the most incompetent, overthought, ridiculous exercise that I've ever been through. You'd think that this guy, I remember my boss, who's responsible for all of this, is trying to basically build a facsimile of a Rudolf Schindler house on a stage, and he's obsessing about all these details, and he's clearly too inexperienced to know what matters,
Yeah, where to cut
what
and
you can
off. Yeah.
actually see on camera, what people are going to notice. And he's doing it for all, he's working on this thing for all the wrong reasons. He's like basically building it for his photographic portfolio,
Right.
and not for the actual director. And it ended up costing the production company a ton of money, and because it was late, and that was really the beginning of the end for him. I mean, he was kind of a cokehead.
Yeah, that's kind of common.
Yeah, at that time for sure. And he was he just he was drunk with the with the um with the power that he had been bestowed on him pretty quickly. You know, he'd been in LA for maybe 2 years, or and suddenly he's production designing these big commercials and making $1,200 a day, or, you know, I don't know what the equivalent, you know, whatever his rate was, which was, I would take that today. You know, but it was a hell of a lot of money back then. And, you know, just in blowing up these jobs, just job after job after job until he basically left town. I mean, he's very talented, but way too precious about what he was doing as a, you know, the fact of the matter is, you know, you're basically serving you're just serving a story, and the camera doesn't pick up half the shit that you design, and you just got to get
commercial. It's 30 seconds.
It's a commercial, right, right. Anyway, he went off and did like a Roland Joffe film, and as a production designer, and then I don't think he ever, and then he never worked again. I think he went back to England and did something else.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean, he was kind of a train wreck, you know, in the making. But I worked for him for a while, and I learned all the things you're not supposed to do. But I did do a lot of things, you know. But he also did some things very, very well. I mean, he's an incredible illustrator, and we were working with amazing directors, and you know, we were working with Fincher, Tony Scott, Sam Baer, Mark Romanek, Romanek, depending on how you want to say it. We worked with some great people, but I mean, probably the biggest horror story for me was when I did a pilot for this is like when I was trying to work on my own. I did a pilot for MTV for a show that my friend created, wrote and directed and produced the first pilot called, it was called Space Monkeys. It was monkeys. He had been working with a lot of chimpanzees on other projects, and became really skilled at working with chimp actors. And he was like, yeah, I'm the chimp guy, right? Like, I'm the old, you know, I'm the act. He's like, I'm just going to lean into this. And so he created this pilot, and basically the same thing happened to me that happened to my boss. I basically tweaked and messed around with this set to the point that we didn't have it done on time. And it was just like probably the most embarrassing moment of one of the most traumatic professional experiences I've ever had, because you've got like 25 people just from the crew and the producers and from MTV just glaring at me, you know. It was a fun set to imagine, though, because it was an interior of a spacecraft that was also a kind of jungle gym for chimps. And I created all these controls, you know, like the instrumentation for the spaceship by taking like Simon toys and different children's kind of games and painting them flat white and embedding them into the walls, you know, so these chimps would be like pushing on the Simon thing and hanging from this bar and inside of this spaceship. We ultimately got it lit, but I just felt like an absolute ass. Anyway, you know, I did that a bit. You got to do those kind of, have those experiences. But then I did a few music videos, and then the last thing I worked on really was The Matrix, and I worked as a set designer on that. And I guess I wasn't in the union quite in the union yet, so they called me a visual consultant. But that was fun in 2001.
Which scenes come to mind of the ones that you worked on?
On The Matrix?
Yeah.
I worked a lot on what's the world that they live in underground? What's it called? I worked a lot on that.
Okay.
What's that called? Anyway, um, Zion, right? Um,
Zion. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, we Zion was conceived by, these illustrators. This guy, um, Jeff Darrow, I think is
Oh,
his name,
yeah, yeah.
illustrator. And, my job was to really work with the production designer to kind of give form to those, to a lot of his illustrations. And Zion was conceived almost like a kind of architectural uh, design, in that it was conceived in its entirety. It wasn't really kind of conceived of as like a set. It was there was an initial illustration, and then they had this crazy model maker who built this model of it. Is like, you know 12 feet in diameter. It was amazing. And then the Wachowski brothers would come in with like a lens and like look at how they wanted to frame it, because they wanted to they were conceiving of the movie um, in it digitally in its entirety. So they created animatics for the whole film, and then created this kind of um, the project, the whole movie was made through this kind of iterative process. So they'd start with illustrations, then they'd create these crude models that became animatics, and then the animatics got given to the set designers and got developed more, and then they built a physical model, and then we went back and reworked the digital models. And so it was like always kind of building on what had been done before. And when they were trying to imagine scenes that happened in Zion, and in the big dome of Zion, and like kind of underworld of Zion, like the big wide shots, they would literally like just grab a just hold a lens and look at it, and say this would be a cool shot. And then they could frame that up in Maya. And then they would, we would all discuss like, well, what's going to be built, and what's going to be digital.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like one of the first movies that actually did that in 2001 or so. So I worked on that. That was really the last movie I worked on. At that point I decided, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't know. It's fun, but yeah.
I had always read and heard that the Wachowski brothers were really hands-on in that whole process, which was both good and bad. Do you find that to be true? I mean, tell me if you know this to be true or not, but I've seen that they did a lot of the storyboarding and everything for the movie long before the director ever stepped in.
Well, they're the directors.
Well,
So
yeah, I mean the director of photography.
yeah, of course, yeah. They worked really hard on the pre-visualization of the whole thing, right? They're, like I was saying, like they it doesn't seem new today, but the whole project was, they built that whole world digitally first. And
Right.
whether that digital material got used to actually produce a set or not, or it was just done as CGI, didn't really matter. They wanted to create this whole world in a kind of digital space, and then decide what they were going to shoot live, and what they were going to shoot, or what they were going to make in CGI. And so, I mean, the whole thing was conceptualized as like a comic book. I mean, it was not to say that was a unique idea, but they could really illustrate any. They went about making that movie with the idea that they could illustrate, they could build, they could create anything that they could illustrate.
Well,
And so
Darrow
yeah,
does a lot of that. I mean, that is what he's
yeah,
done a lot. Shaolin Cowboy is a pretty popular series
yeah,
that he did,
yeah.
and his
So
stuff is epic like that.
yeah, yeah. And he's not even really, I didn't ever see him as being like he's not a storyboard artist. He doesn't work that way. It
No,
didn't seem to me.
he's a visual.
Yeah,
His visual storyteller. It's not your
yeah,
typical. He's not your typical comic book guy. He's more like he draws drawings and then puts them together.
yeah. I mean, he would, he did like key illustrations that became the conceptual undergirding um, for sets and ships and Zion and
Yeah,
stuff. But it wasn't like you couldn't take like a Jeff Darrow image and translate it directly into being a set. Oh, maybe they did. Maybe we did. I don't remember.
well, you
I
could
wasn't. I wasn't
definitely.
involved in that high level of it.
His style is so sketchy and so
Yeah,
interesting that
yeah,
it's not that clean,
right.
but it
His
definitely captures
perspective.
the essence.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of those guys, like his. I remember like working with illustrators. Like my training was in architecture, so I could conceive. Like
Yeah,
when I drew space, it was really like I knew the dimensions of it. I knew, you know, um, the kind of geometry of it in my
right.
mind. And I was imagining that as I was drawing it. With like some of those more comic-y illustrators, they don't think that way. Everything is flat. It's like they don't know if there's an arc in the architecture, what that even means. Like
Right.
they don't think spatially in the same way that we do. So it was, you know, I think of him as being like one of those guys.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you're right. I mean, that's a lot. I use storyboard artists, and yeah, it's interesting.
I
So
mean, he's not fast either.
yeah,
He's meticulous. I'd like go and look at that guy, like what he was doing, and he'd just be like, you know, tooling away on these super just obsessive, compulsive,
yeah.
detailed ink drawings, and it's just like, what the fuck?
I know I've seen him at
Amazing.
Comic Con. I've seen him at Comic Con at his booth, and yeah, he's amazing. He's yeah, but I could feel when you say that. I could feel this how the Matrix developed off of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's. I mean, his stuff is so epic. It really does feel I could see where that happens. So that's really cool. I mean, I think it's also great with the Wachowski brothers are similar to like the Coen brothers, where their creative is they're in the creative. You know what I mean? Like they're involved with it in a sense.
Oh yeah. I mean, they understand every aspect of the movie. They're not. On the one hand, I guess I don't know them. I worked with them. I was around them. I don't know them.
Right.
But they seem very much they're movie nerds. They're not. They kind of operate sort of outside of Hollywood.
Right.
They come with a real vision. They're deeply um, immersed in it when the film starts production. They they've thought through so much detail in a way, and they're visualists. They're not. I never cared for any of their stories. I don't care for their, you know, some of the stories don't even make sense to me. So like but their visuals are so
Yeah.
cool, and their choreography of their and editing is so cool. And I mean that's how I think maybe that's why you see it that way, because they have to be they have to have an intimate sense of like cinematography and costume design and effects and all that. So they're having very tight relationships with all those people that are running those departments on the movie.
Thanks for listening. The authors of Growing Up Aspen would like to thank you, and would like to also thank the Aspen Times and the Aspen Daily News for giving us materials for our book, Growing Up Aspen, Adventures of the Unsupervised, which you can get at twistandturnpress.com and any local bookstore. Thanks.